think this debate about what not to wear doesn't really focus on men. It really focuses more, has begun to focus on more and more on the niqab and the hijab. We've also seen recently a large number of, hate crimes. And let me tell you, these hate crimes are not just in the West. Even in a place like Kashmir, we've had militant women actually throwing acid on women who don't wear the hijab and the niqab. So let me first, so I really think this is going to be quite exciting, a dialogue rather than a debate. And I have some wonderful voices on my left and my right. We are going to be joined very soon by Maria.
Actually, off karo. Actually, off karo.
Introduce these young women who've been working on gender. So, to begin with, there's Samya, who's an anthropologist and associate professor of economics and social science at Brack University. Her research includes cultural activism of Bengali Muslims and the impact of secondary, secular and madrasa education on gender norms and practices. She also works to bring gender equality in Muslim families. On my immediate right is Amina Yaqeen. She's a senior lecturer of Urdu and post-colonial studies at SOS University of London. Her work includes cultural studies of South Asian literature, gender, sexuality and British Islam. She has co-authored a wonderful book, it's available outside, Framing Muslims, Stereotype and Representation After 9/11 with Harvard Press. And her forthcoming books also include some very exciting titles called Contrasting Islamophobia in Muslims and Muslims Trust and Multiculturalism. On my left right now is Tasafi. She's a development activist for gender and human rights, and she's the founder of Boni Shika, I hope I got it right, Unlearn Gender, which works towards gender equality. In 2015, she spearheaded a collection of monologues based on the stories of women in Bangladesh titled It's a She Thing. I really want to even engage with her on that because I think it's a very exciting thing to do. And is now working on a theatrical production around male stereotypes called Men Don't Talk. I am sure the next Dhaka Lit Fest there's going to be a lot of men who would love to engage with you on this. And then we're also going to be joined by Hariam Maria Chaudhary. She's the founder and mind behind fashion brand Tahur. Tahur means purity, so and it's a very traditional Islamic word. So I guess it's all about halal fashion, as they now call it. She graduated from North South University in linguistics and started a career as a teacher. And in 2012, realized her dream with Tahur. So I'll just try and set the tone of the thing by just, saying what I really believe and my take on this subject, which I've been speaking for quite a long time on Indian television and writing, is I really believe that forcing women into hijab or out of hijab are both equally oppressive and sinful. Clearly, the Quran says, like Rahafiddin, there is no compulsion in religion. And, I also believe that this is a form of cultural apostasy. I hope I'm not hung for that, but I really do think that I do have problems personally with the black abaya and the black niqab because I see it as a very successful export of Saudi cultural and religious hegemony that is being funded and spread into our local communities and cultures. One of my teachers, Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, who's this great American scholar, he describes Islam as a beautiful stream that flows through various lands and it takes on the colors of the land that it flows through. So it's not like I'm against covering the head because we all know it as Muslim piety. And, but our grandmothers did it and we just had a dupatta and, you know, I have no problems when I go to dargahs, when I go to Muslim gatherings. I also wear a headscarf, but I refuse to do it in completely black because I feel it's complete, you know, it's just too much of Saudi Islam that is being funded and destroying our organic Islam as we know it in the subcontinent. I also think it's become politics of identity, you know, a very in-your-face kind of Islam. And I can understand that to an extent, and I think it's particularly in the West where people really have no space for expression of the sacred and are demeaning Islam in the most ugly manner in their discourse. So before I, you know, share some of my other thoughts, I would like to maybe begin with Samia. And I'm so happy to meet all these young Bangladeshi women with wonderful voices and lovely things to say. So I also want to begin, just before opening the debate, remind you of a beautiful hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, difference of scholars is a blessing. So whatever we do, we have to respect the other person's view and, you know, be accepting of another viewpoint without being militant. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm an anthropologist, and a lot of my work has been looking at not just women who choose to veil, but the discourse around that, sort of the discursive terrain that allows you or does not allow you to dress in particular ways. There's definitely been, I think most of us around this room would agree that there's been a great proliferation of wearing the hijab or the niqab. More and more women that we didn't expect would sort of turn to conservative dressing have done so over the last 10 years. And as an anthropologist, my initial question was to sort of interrogate why this is happening. And this happens at several levels. It happens at the level of the political. There's a shift in the terrain. There's really a flooding of the public space with images, with ideas, with new constructions of the pious Muslim self. It also happens very much, and this is not delinked from the political and public, it also happens very much at the personal level. So there's a marriage between the two in which this plays out, and oftentimes you'll see that this doesn't turn out to be a very rewarding experience at the personal level. Or it can turn out to be something that just works for a vast number of university students. It's just something that they do. They need to get to university. In the rural areas, you know, it's mobility. They need to get to school. They need to get to their madrasas. And it's not really something that speaks to their construction of self in great many ways, as I think we would like to think it to do so within a liberal repertoire. And there are others who actually really enjoy it. It becomes, it's a journey, it's a strive. They derive great pleasure and a great sense of agency from doing this. There's a lot of the other non-veiling community who are completely all right with it, who are not bothered with it. There are people in the non-veiling community who are bothered by the political implications of this, about what it may, how it may speak to a woman's sense of, you know, pursuing a trajectory of empowerment. And there are people who worry about, well, you know, that sort of our liberal repertoire is being challenged, and this does not bode well. So I actually would like to, for us to maybe redirect the conversation. This seems to be a fairly divided terrain, especially amongst the middle class. I think it kind of really rubs against our middle class sensitivities. There are problems on both sides. You know, dressing in particular ways is never is never a question that is free of politics, whichever way that is. And the divisions, I'd like to call to question some of the divisions to see if we can really interrogate and understand what's at stake either way, and if there can be a conversation that emerges out of a scrutiny of what's at stake. Whether hijab is, choosing to wear or wanting to wear, forcing to dress in any, I completely agree with Sadia, being forced to dress in any way is not something that I would condone as an anthropologist or just a citizen.
Samia, can I just respond to you? What disturbs me is that we have, while in the West there is a no hijab, there is a hijab day, but there is no hijab day. I mean, we have to accept there are communities that, for instance, in Iran, in Afghanistan, and, amongst other places that are really, really where hijab is still a symbol of subjugating and a way of subjugating women. And I don't think there are enough voices. There are a lot of voices that come out to support the hijab, but frankly, I don't think there are enough voices that come out against its imposition. And I think that's a problem in the Muslim discourse.
Absolutely, and I think those spaces must be created and those spaces must be celebrated. Now, celebrating Hijab Day or an International Hijab Day in the US is actually started by a woman of Bangladeshi origin in the US, and it seems to have really gathered steam. Whether we also celebrate those things, what does it mean for us to veil in Bangladesh, let's say, in Bengal, or in, colonial India? I think is a question that can't be answered by looking at what's going on or what's happened in the West. So I also want to move away from that dichotomy a little bit. Like you said, your grandmother used to dress in a particular way. It had a certain kind of meaning. It generated a certain kind of force and not others, right? I mean, I think that's the conversation we need to be having. Yeah. So just because there is a celebration of the Hijab Day, I don't mind if we have a celebration of the Hijab Day. Actually, this year, there was a very muted, one of the largest women's rights organizations actually appropriated that day. And, I'd gone in to talk to some of them, and they said, and this is a very left of center, I wouldn't have imagined 5 years ago that they would have done this.
Can I ask now Amina to come in, and then we'll come back to you on that.
Yeah. Amina, so let me just end it by saying that I think what this means for us is a conversation that we need to be having as well on our own terms, without constant reference to, of course, what's going on at the global is important, but it doesn't necessarily always have to cast a shadow.
Yes. Amina has done some, I've got to know her in the last few days, and I'm very fascinated with her research on the Muslim Barbie doll. And so I'm going to ask her, because she's working on stereotyping, that have we really, as a community, I think, if you look at the golden period of Islamic civilization, we were actually we were defined by our contribution to the arts, to poetry, to literature, to science, And now I feel that as a community, we've really just allowed ourselves to be defined by a small garment. And is that a problem? I mean, have we really allowed the Muslim community to be stereotyped and to be, allowed globally to be defined as by the hijab?
I think, is this working? I think, can you hear me? Okay. So lots for me to answer over there. Let me start.
Is it working?
Can you hear? Yeah. Okay, that's better, isn't it? I think I was just holding it at the wrong angle. So you mentioned the global perception, right, of the Muslim community, and it's so difficult to define the Muslim community if you think about and you can also think about the Ummah here, and the fact that there are communities that we are talking about, and they're not uniform, they are very different, and they're very pluralistic. So that's important to underline. But then the other thing, in the global mediascape, as it were, and I remember this from when I started my work on the stereotyping project, was conversation that BBC producer who had done the series The Living Islam, Hugh Purcell, and I think Tariq Maudud had been working, who's a prominent sociologist in the UK, had been working on this. And Hugh Purcell said at the time that there are three things that the British media want to know about Islam, you know, and one of those things is the treatment of women. So women are always at the center of any conversation about Islam, and both from the West and from the Muslim community within. So it's a double-edged sword. And I think it just sort of perpetuates stereotype and a stereotyping from outside and a self-stereotyping from within. So how do we try and break up or open up this conversation? And one of the things, here I'll go into the doll story. So it started when I was in Lahore. I had accidentally gone to an Al-Huda dars, and I didn't manage to get into the dars because it was too packed. There was no room to go in. So I was just outside sampling the stalls, and at one of the stalls I saw this doll, and it was a Razan doll, and I asked the guy about it, and he said, oh, it's something, you know, I've really wanted to get for my children. And then I researched it and I looked it up, and in the UK at the time it was very popular around Eid time as a present for Muslim girls. And it's a lifestyle doll. It was, it's set up by a company called Noor Art that were working from Michigan in the US at the time. And then they moved to Texas, and it's a story of a couple. One, the husband is a Palestinian migrant living in the US, and the wife is a convert to Islam who was a former New York concert pianist. And they set up the company Noor Art, and one of their products is this Muslim lifestyle doll. And what's interesting about the doll now, I don't know how many people here have children at home, probably quite a lot of you, and I imagine they have dolls they have had dolls, whether they're girls or boys at some stage, or been fascinated by dolls. And Barbie has always played a great role in the global marketplace. So what's interesting, if you look at the Razan doll, is that she's a copy of a copy. She's a copy of the Barbie doll. But the difference is what she wears. So she wears a jilbab, the abaya, when she's outside, and her hijab, and when she's inside the house, she can dress as she pleases. And I mean, dress as she pleases, the dresses were a little bit 1950s America. They weren't your Beyonce kind of clothes. So there's a particular modesty to her lifestyle. And the body shape as well has been toned down. So, you know, if you look at Barbie, she's very busty. She's very sort of, you know, her feet are arched really high for the high heel shoes that she wears. So Razan is toned down, and I wish I'd brought her with me.
Yes.
Because
I'd love
to show you. And she also has, very importantly, if you undress Barbie, you can take all her clothes off, right? If you undress Razan, she has knickers on, so her vital body parts are covered. And I think if you tried, you can take them off. And one of the things I noticed is that children, certainly my children, and I've spoken to a lot of other people's children as well, mothers, and they've said they all just take the clothes off the dolls. And when you look at the website of Noor Art, Mormons were writing in to them saying, we love this doll because, you know, children, it's so modest and it's so good because this is just the values that we're not finding in America. So I think that was a response. And if you think about that response of Razan as a lifestyle doll who's packaged, and there's teacher Razan, and there's sort of lots of professions that are suitable that she's projected in. But you've also had that, for example, with the Barbie doll, that the Barbie doll has been used to manufacture ethnicity. So they've launched for example, the Indian Barbie, and the ethnicity of that Barbie, you know, tries to represent a particular type of Indianness. And it turns out into a little bit of an Orientalist fantasy. It's not quite what they thought, and it doesn't work quite as well. People in India want less of the Indian Barbie and more of the ordinary Barbie. And then you also have that whole story of Barbie and Ken. Barbie doesn't really come from a family background as such. She's, you don't hear much about her family. She's got boyfriends and stuff. So the people who were interviewing this couple about the Razan said to her, is there going to be an Ahmed doll somewhere soon? And they said, no, this is not. So I think this was something that was also happening not just in America, but if you look at the at the Middle East and in Iran as well, you've got dolls. There's a Dara and Sara doll in Iran, which is a brother and sister duo, and it's more of a national doll phenomenon. And then in Syria, you've got the Fulla doll, and Fulla is a little bit more fashionable. She's a bit more kind of high society. She wears Carolina Herrera and those sorts of things. So it's, but I think the point of it really is about the performativity of identity, that one has to perform a certain identity when one is outside the house and when one is inside the house. So what is the subjectivity of the female subject within that whole narrative and conversation? And I was quite, in the UK, we've had really interesting scenarios and cases. There was one very famous case of Shabina Begum, who wore the hijab to school and the jilbab, and she was eventually suspended from school because there were health and safety concerns about the length of her jilbab. For example, I think it was to do with like chemistry experiments, and they're a little bit wild on health and safety in the UK, so anything they can get you to stop doing around health and safety, they will. But it's really, that story got a lot of media coverage and press, and she took it to court, and the court said that the school is right in this decision, and then she challenged it and took it to the EU court, where the EU upheld her appeal. And then it sort of went back and forth, and then it also, we also found out that her brother was a very big supporter of her case, and he was a member of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a radical group, if you want to use the term. So it's complicated, the story, but then you've also got a real market of modest lifestyle fashion, of women wearing hijab. So we have somewhere
here. Can I come to Tasafi before? I'm very intrigued by the brand name Tahur, and but I'm going to just before come to Tasafi and ask her, is it really, with these stories that you gathered, what was your biggest takeaway, especially in regarding to, what to wear and what women really felt on the ground? And is it really about, at that rural level, is it about politics of identity, which to an extent I do feel that it is about that, the political element does have a lot to play, whether it be in the West, and we see more young people wearing it in universities, whether it be here, whether it be in, in our countries. Muslims are making an absolute, almost an issue, I would say, about it. What is your experience and the stories that you collected?
Well, to start with, the hijab is personally not an area that I work with a lot. Talking about the rural level, I think, as such, I do go work a lot in the rural level, mostly for my research work, not so much for Purnishika, but outside of that. And one of the things I have noticed is there is a shift in clothing, but more from saris to like a long gown kind of a thing. And it's quite interesting to actually see that in the rural areas, because you see women just walking around with this like big gown, what we would usually call a maxi. And it's like a like this long printed gown, and now it comes with a same printed scarf. And it's something that I'm only seeing for the last two years, I would say. So it is a shift, and I think it's interesting because it's sort of like a shift to wearing something which is comfortable and easy, and makes it more mobile for them to move around in. It's also interesting because it's not at all a very traditional thing. It's also something that we would usually, like especially my mom's generation, my grandmother's generation, would usually consider it to be a house clothing, housewear sort of a thing, and which somehow in the rural areas have become the easy, accessible way to just walk around, and you just throw it on whatever you're wearing. underneath it, and you can walk around and feel more comfortable, more covered, I would say. Or just, I guess, in a way, more secure. And I think in that sense, when we talk about women's wear, it's a lot about security for us in Bangladesh overall, in Dhaka, definitely. That's where I can talk about from my experiences of growing up in Dhaka and of the women that I know and stories that we've collected also. And I think in that sense, it's not only also about the hijab, it's just this concept of being perceived. And I think that's the main problem when it comes to women's clothing. It's a lot about perception.
When you say, I'm sorry, I don't really understand you because I'm not coming from that space. When you say it's about security, are you talking about being threatened if you don't wear one? Or, I mean, how do you feel more secure or less secure whether you wear?
Question.
There's something I don't understand because
that's
I
a very
don't come
good
from that
question.
space.
I think for most women who live in Dhaka, I think you get it. Largely because
I've heard
I know.
I've heard it otherwise from one or two friends also that I've been meeting, but I've not understood it. Can you just,
I will
what
definitely,
really is the security?
I think it's just the fact. It's not about being threatened. It's a mix of being stared at, getting comments, but even more than that, it's the idea that I would get less of that maybe. And not necessarily that it works out. But I
would think Bengalis are extremely civilized and we don't see the kind of, come on, you can clap. I would say, I'm not going to define a community, but I think Delhi and Punjab and Haryana and our spaces are far more rough. And there's much more chauvinism in our societies than I see here. Here I actually see a lot of respect for women. And I do think that that is a key indicator of a society's progress or spirituality, or I think, like you said, that it is, that they talk about women as an indicator. But let's face it, I mean, I think a society should be rightly judged by the way it treats its women and its minorities. And the Prophet said that anybody who treats women well are the best of people. So it is an indicator. So could you elaborate for me on the security part, just to understand what it's about?
Quite frankly, like, I would just speak from my own personal experience. And I wear pretty much all different kinds of clothing. But there's a certain thing I would keep in mind if I'm walking outdoors. I will ensure my legs are covered, at least up to here. So somewhere below my knees. Skirts are not something that is seen usually.
This is a cultural thing, I mean,
it
even
is a
in
cultural
India, you
thing.
see the foreigners and you see young girls now, wearing very bold clothes. But that's really a cultural
Of
thing.
course,
that
I'm talking about the cultural aspect of it.
Yeah.
But the cultural aspect also says that you have to dress a certain way and you have to look a certain way. I'm not saying it is not cultural. A lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is about what it means to look a certain way. A lot of it is about, if you look this way, that means you fall under a certain category. If you look anywhere beyond it, then you fall under a different category. And I think that categorization is the security aspect. Like, wearing sleeveless,
really
I think
Dhaka or in Bangladesh in particular, would you really feel more secure, let's say, walking in a crowded market? In wearing a abaya and a thing rather than a sari?
I can't
Maybe
say about
we
abaya,
wouldn't.
but
We
definitely,
wouldn't, but I think some people would.
But
Really?
yeah, I mean, if I'm going to some place like Newmarket, I will ensure I'm wearing salwar kameez, or definitely at least a dupatta. Even if I'm wearing a t-shirt and trousers, I would still throw a dupatta on. And I think, and I would like to say that it doesn't make me feel more secure, but it does.
But this is a change, right? This would be a shift in the last decade or so.
It depends also. Like, I know when my mother was young, wearing sleeveless.
Yes, please.
So I think, I think we're very aware of this shift just because of the visibility of certain kinds of ways of dressing now, right? But I think there's also a certain romanticization we do when we break from the past. So when we assume that the past was problem-free, I mean, I think that's something that works very forcefully in our imaginary, right? So if you look at, let's say, a very a dominant middle-class framing of the ideal Bengali woman, right? And Nayanika Mukherjee, who's actually here at the Lit Fest, I think she was on yesterday, in her book, Spectral Wound, writes very beautifully how the image of the Birangana, the raped woman, you know, how she set the tone, or how she was very counterposed against a hegemonic Islam that was deployed by the Pakistani state, and then how her image was projected as the woman of the nation, beleaguered as she was, you know, left behind as she, well, not left behind, she was projected as the Birangana, the hero, but she was actually left behind in many ways. And that's that, when you say that women become the emblem of the nation, I think that's the issue that we need to understand. It's not a problem that, yes, even the Prophet Muhammad may have said that you have to treat minorities well, but how do we categorize that woman? How do we give her that dominant image? Where is her voice in this? Where is her progress in this? And that's a story that keeps getting rehashed. That's the problem. And I don't think, I think that's really the problem of, you know, nation states, of national formations, of, you know, trans-local politics. So
yes, absolutely. Can I bring Maria in now? And who is it really about style statements now? The hijab has become a great style statement, and you also have now international designers and, you know, Paris Bay, French designers coming out with the whole hijab line. Of course, there's also pure economics and industry, because there's a lot of money, and it's a great market that is being tapped upon. But how do you see this play out, particularly in the subcontinent or Bangladesh, or, you know, with your brand name and Tahoor? So what all do you do, and how do you feel about this whole debate?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Hania Maria. I design modest clothing. So that's my job. I have been just doing this for the last 4 years. Okay. What was I doing before that? I was in advertising and PR in Asiatic. So that me and this me is quite a contradictory person. Mm-hmm. But the core self is still there, who is still alive, and that is something that has not changed. So I'll tell a little bit about how I started. That way it would be easier to relate maybe. I had my twin boys when I was 30, and I had to take care of them at home, and I was not being able to juggle my work of a PR manager and being a mother. And after 5 o'clock, my eyes would tear up, and I would not be able to concentrate in my meetings. So just one fine morning, I told my boss that I don't want to work anymore, because I am not giving my best at my work. And this is not me, and I'm not fine with this. So I just quit. So stayed back at home for 4 months, and I started getting into those classes. You went to Al Huda, right? So I went there once in 2001, 2. I started hijab, and then I left it. I started doing it for some time, and then I became invisible. I saw my friends were not seeing me. I was there, but not there. They did not even see that I existed, and I hated that experience. I was seeing my husband then. I was dating him. He would behave in some awkward manner, and he would say that I don't know this woman, what you have become, and cannot relate to you. I was young, and then that was the time when I also traveled to Turkey. I was participating in an intercultural program, and I thought that this was just not me, and I'm not being honest to myself. I'm just doing it because I went by the flow. I started. I'm not even regular with my prayers. So what is this thing? What does this mean? I'm just doing this because I have started it, and now I have to put up the show. I'm not going to do that. So I left it, and I had, again, those questions. Oh, what happened? And, you know, you've started that, and now it's gone. So it's like a ping pong ball, are you? So thing is, the entire thing of hijab, I believe, I'm talking for myself, that it has to come from understanding, from knowledge, because with knowledge comes behavioral change. That's what I have been, promoting back when I was in INGO, that with knowledge comes behavioral change. So I was doing
Can
my
you,
studies.
we are a little running short of time.
Yeah.
Could you just do tell us about how is this a fashion brand and how well it's doing,
Fashion
and what do you
brand,
see
see,
the
this-
changes in people that come to you, the profile of the people, women who are buying?
They're
your
coming from
clothes?
all walks of life.
Okay.
From students to lawyers to doctors
Mm-hmm.
to engineers to business corporate ladies. I'm having them all. So see, the demand is there, right? Like the way she was pointing out, the Barbie is also changing because the children has to relate to that. They're looking at their mom. The other day I saw this little girl and her mom identically dressed. So there is this thing about being able to relate to. If the doll that I'm playing with is like the mom that I look upon, it makes more sense to that little kid. So maybe that was one perspective I was thinking on. Coming back to the fashion brand, see, the demands are there. Because of the amount of globalization that we are having, the communication has gone like haywire.
Yes.
Back then, like my dadi and my nani did not knew they had that beautiful dupatta that they would wrap around before they would walk out in their saris. And we would do decorations on that dupatta. Because when I
So
would
there
give...
is a style statement involved
Right.
here as well. This
Right.
is what I'm saying.
Right.
Okay,
And
I'm
because
sorry,
we are
I just
women.
got a reminder that my time is going, our time is going to be up, and I have to be a little responsible and give this wonderful packed audience. I'm so happy to see so many faces, and men, women, all young, old. So can I ask you to maybe raise your hand and ask some questions, and two-person in particular or in general? We have 15 minutes, and yeah. I know your name, you're Umar. I just signed my book for you, so.
Thank you.
And I'm glad it's a man who asking the first question.
Actually, I apologize for being the man to ask the question about a ladies panel.
No, you
This
don't
is
have
not a
to.
situation of mansplaining for sure.
Yeah.
I just have a question regarding, you said something very specific, Amna Yaqeen, about performativity of action. And there's a really great article, and actually, Samia also touched on this, on performativity and being subjective. As an anthropologist, obviously that's more important to you. So Leila Abu Lughod wrote an article about Egyptian women who take on the hijab and purposefully go to the mosque every day in order to become pious. And they
Saba
don't...
Mahmood.
Saba Mahmood, I'm so sorry. Leila Abu Lughod wrote the other one. Saba Mahmood wrote this article about performing action in order to embrace your culture and your piety. So in that respect, does it matter if the hijab is a cultural statement or a religion statement? If it's a question of agency, then what's the issue, right? Like, and I think we vaguely touched on this point through all four of you. So if you could comment on that further.
Would you like to respond to that?
So the question of agency is, I think that's a very important question with regards to the whole debate around the hijab, because often it's the agency that is lost because so many people want to speak for these women, be it the burkini ban in France or in various parts of Europe, what's happened around women's dress. The understanding is that it becomes this representation of oppression. And as Samia was saying, it's about opening up the conversation and saying, okay, how do women play out that particular role? Now, The Politics of Piety is a very particular book in relation to the mosque movement in Egypt. So I think it's difficult to kind of transport it across the thing, but
And there are questions in that book that are muted as well. So.
Yeah, there are questions that are muted, and and I suppose one of the things is, but what's important in it is also about how ideas of religion have traveled through technology over a very, different sort of times, and we are living in an internet age, and I think over here, what you have is a narrative that's a counter-narrative that's coming out through sources that are not the mainstream sources. And I think those are the sources where you can start to look and see where are the counter-narratives, what kind of counter-narratives are there. So and I think there's a variety. I mean, I looked at the dolls example as one, and so, for one newspaper, that can be an example of, I remember a headline, for example, in The Sun, something like, Burqa Barbie puts fun into fundamentalism. So if you can't work beyond those stereotypes, it becomes very problematic to think about the subjectivities of, and I think identity, for men and for women, when it comes to the religious space in the West particularly, it becomes hugely performative, and Muslim identity has become, one has to perform one's Muslimness to be recognized, to be understood, and also there's so many things that have happened that are just so wrong. So it's
I would, once I wrote in an article, and I think some of the greatest problems with the Muslim mainstream discourse is really Sheikh Google and imamfatwa.com. I mean, this is where people are really today getting, a lot of young people are getting their Islam from, and WhatsApp, and I'm sometimes fed up with the kind of religious stuff that I get on my WhatsApp, and many of them from my own relatives, and everybody's trying to convert somebody else into their kind of Islam. So, we have to actually in the end believe that there are various interpretations.
Yes, and there is no one perfect Islam.
And so can I ask other questions, and no comments, please, just questions, short answers.
Can I just
It's actually a challenge.
Can you get up and speak a little louder?
Must I get up?
Yeah, just.
Okay. It's a sort of a challenge, I think, because the idea that the issue around hijab and what we wear, etc., is a middle-class phenomenon in Bangladesh, yes, I would challenge that. I think when I do my research in the countryside, yes, I see the maxis, but I also see the black stuff and all that. And that is new, and that has not been there in the countryside before. We're seeing a lot of it. And that, what you're calling performativity, can be quite, it imposes a model on everyone. It starts to become the hegemony in the countryside. And for a lot of very poor working class women who have to go out and work, and who must go out and work in the fields, the idea that the only way you can be a good Muslim is by donning this kind of clothing is deeply difficult. So it's not particularly solely a middle class argument. It is something that is troubling for extremely poor women who cannot afford the luxury of staying at home.
Any questions? And can I ask you to refrain from comments? That's a very, very nice comment you made, but we'd like some quick questions. There is somebody there, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Tasneem Mahbub from Dhaka University. I often see my students coming with hijab and after one semester letting it go. And when I ask them, they say that they are not following hijab as a part of piety, but for some other reason, social reason, or maintaining the hair or something. So these women or girls who wear hijab but don't follow the fundamental issues of Islam, like saying prayer, what kind of message are they spreading?
I don't know.
I think very simply that it doesn't always have to be about Islam, and it isn't. I mean, it isn't. I mean, for a lot of women, it is about convenience. For a lot of women, it is about being able to hop on the bus. So, I mean, I think we need to recognize all the various kind of permutations in which this appears.
And it does not necessarily have to give a specific message all the time, because wearing a sari in a specific way does not have to be.
Yes.
There are so many ways that we drape our saris. There are so many ways we wear our kurtis. So not necessarily all of them are giving messages, but when it comes to hijab, it does come,
Can I sort of just respond to that? And I say, you've touched the heart of the panel there about what not to wear, because I would say that actually what you wear does have an impact in terms of how and what people think, how they place you. So I think it's a really important point that you've made in terms of what kurta or kurti or whatever you wear, because immediately, depending on the context that you're in, you will be understood and recognized.
Yes. Before you have it to speak for yourself, your clothes speak for you.
I think
that's what does,
I think some of the, again, I keep talking about, because I do believe there are serious problems with the Muslim communities. I think a lot of our problem is that we are focusing too much on the external and less on the internal. Piety has to really begin from within, purifying one's heart and being compassionate and having respect for the other, which we are losing as a whole. Any other question, please? Yes?
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
So I'd like to refer to the burqa ban in France and imposition of a headscarf or a burqa in countries in the Middle East such as Saudi Arabia. So do you think there should be a legal imposition on what a woman wears?
No, the answer is very short.
And how to get out of that, the need to have a legal imposition on what a woman wears?
There is no need to have a legal imposition on what women wear. The minute you start to put an imposition on, that's when you get reactionary politics happening. I mean, what's happening in Europe is a narrative of well, there is an Islamophobic narrative, there is a politicization of Islam narrative that goes back to Orientalist ideology of Islam. So there are lots of things that are happening, and there's the rise of the extreme right in Europe as well that is promoting this kind of legislation and this kind of reading. I mean, speaking of the UK, I've looked, there are people who have this argument and scholars who say that there should be recognition of minority groups on the basis of ethnicity. So for example, the Jewish community and the Sikh community in Britain are recognized as an ethnic group, but Muslims are not. And some of the sociologists who work on this particular topic have argued that Muslim identity should also be recognized as an ethnic minority identity. It's not. It's just so that, you know, things like, so that the racialization around it becomes more prominent and can be mediated through legislation. I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily the way forward in terms of how we proceed with understanding and the functioning of minority identities within majority communities. And I think those are sort of local issues for us here as well, for you here in Bangladesh, for us in Pakistan. You know, we have a huge issue around how we deal with our minorities. So I think it's an important question, and it's something that, maybe some of the other panel would also want to listen.
I think it's time, but I would like to, how many? Yeah. I'd also like to, again, respond to you that I think we have to accept that both positions, the imposing and the banning, are really oppressive. Ultimately, it really has to be about free choice. I'd gone to Turkey, and I saw so many hijabs, and I was quite surprised. And I asked a friend, I said, well, how come there's so many hijabs in Turkey now? Because, so she said, because we are expressing our freedom, because for so many years we were not allowed to wear it. So it was a very interesting response, because I'm not coming from that space
Well,
at all.
colleagues, I have colleagues in Indonesia who wear the hijab and are very progressive, and they say very clearly that there was a movement, there was a vast movement which was in protest to the Suharto regime. You know, this kind of Islamization. So that's one point. You did say that there's this kind of Wahhabi influence, and I totally agree that there's been Saudi money that's pumping into various parts of the world for 20, 30 years, and maybe we're seeing a lot of the cultural and the political effects of that today. But I think just to fall back on that argument is a little bit of a shorthand, because we you know, we've had these movements in history. We've had the Faraizi movement and the Wahhabi movement in the early 19th century in Bengal. Those were peasant movements that were against landlords, Hindu landlords, right? They had a particular kind of function within the rural agrarian community. I think we also need to understand what this movement today, you know, as fragmented as it is. Some of it is coming out of the Imperial College in the UK, some of it is coming out of Al-Huda, some of it is coming out of Middle East, some of it is a response to what's going on in the Middle East, what's been done to the Middle East, and this, you know, wearing your Muslim identity on the sleeve. So I think we need to have a much more open assessment of what the local, how the local reality kind of, you know, absorbs these messages, because they do seem to at some level. I mean, it may not sit well with many of us, but it does, so.
Yes, and the hegemony about the Saudi cultural hegemony is not just restricted to what you wear, it's also about how you treat your women. I mean, you know, there's probably no other place worse there where women are not even allowed to drive. And
that is also, you know, we do say it's Saudi, and a lot of our funding has been Saudi, but if you go to Iran, I mean, I have Iranian colleagues who,
that's also very, very oppressive.
It's very oppressive, and it's very counter to, I mean, the discourse on women, I mean, as sponsored by the state since the fall of the Shah, is fairly regressive. So
I'd like to wind up with one of my favorite quotes from Hazrat Ali, who said that when you oppress people, you blind their soul. And now that you talk of Iran and, you know, and the Saudi, oppression also, you know, is not natural to the human heart. So, you know, people really walk away from it and resent it deeply. And it doesn't always have the desired effect. We know by statistics, and this might surprise some of you, that the largest number of atheists in a Muslim country, in a university, is Saudi Arabia. And the second, probably, if I'm not wrong, would be Iran. A lot of people, the Muslims are not acknowledging it enough, but a lot of people, and young people, you know, in particular, in these countries are leaving Islam. In Iran, there's a whole movement where people have become Christians. And I wouldn't be shocked if the third country would be Pakistan, which is also being very repressive and turning, you know, people, young people, you cannot force anybody into anything. So ultimately, it really has to be about freedom, about choice, and let women be whatever they want to. And I'd just like to again end with a quote from a hadith from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He said, moderation, moderation, moderation. Only with moderation will you succeed. And he also said, beware of extremism, because it was extremism that destroyed communities before you. So I think we all have to be careful that we tread on the middle way and have deep respect for views that are not our own, and allow for diversity in this planet, because diversity is not our idea, it's God's idea. It's a divine idea. Thank you so much.